Welcome back. Before we begin, a reminder. This presentation is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you're experiencing significant anxiety or other mental health concerns, please consult a qualified healthcare provider who can offer guidance tailored to your specific situation. The strategies discussed here help many people, but they may not be right for everyone. If you're working with a mental health professional or taking medication, please continue following their guidance and discuss any new approaches with them first. With that said, I hope you find this information helpful. Let's begin. In Part 1, we focused on the body, how movement, nutrition, sleep, breathing, and sometimes medication can support your nervous system. We learned that anxiety is a physical experience as much as a mental one, and that caring for your body creates the foundation for managing anxiety effectively. But even with a calm body, worry can return if your mind hasn't learned calm too. You might exercise every day, eat perfectly, sleep 8 hours, and still find yourself trapped in anxious thoughts. That's because anxiety lives in the mind as well as the body, and the mind requires its own set of tools. Think about it this way. Your body can be in a state of relative calm, your heart rate normal, your muscles relaxed, while your mind races with worried thoughts. You can be lying in a comfortable bed with nothing physically wrong and still feel tormented by fears about tomorrow, next week, next year. The physical interventions we discussed in Part 1 are essential, but they're not sufficient on their own. We also need to work with the thoughts that create and maintain anxiety. The good news is that just as you can train your body to be calmer, you can train your mind. Just as exercise and nutrition work over time to change your body's baseline state, cognitive techniques work over time to change your mind's habitual patterns. The mind is not fixed. It's flexible. It can learn new ways of thinking. In this part, we'll explore how your thinking patterns fuel anxiety, and more importantly, how you can reshape them. We'll look at how your mind tells stories that create fear, how cognitive behavioral therapy works, how to challenge and change anxious thoughts, and how to gradually face the things that frighten you. By the end, you'll have practical techniques you can use immediately to quiet an anxious mind. To start, think of your mind as a storyteller. It never stops creating narratives about what's happening, what might happen, and what it all means. From the moment you wake up to the moment you fall asleep, your mind is weaving stories, making predictions, drawing conclusions. This storytelling capacity is part of what makes humans so remarkable. It allows us to plan for the future, learn from the past, and navigate complex social situations. But here's the thing about anxiety. It writes dramas faster than peace writes logic. An anxious mind is a creative mind, just creative in directions that cause suffering. Two people can face the exact same situation, like, for example, a sudden change at work, and respond completely differently. One panics, imagining unemployment, financial ruin, and personal failure. The other adapts, seeing an opportunity to learn new skills or move in a different direction. The external situation is identical. The difference isn't the challenge itself. It's the narrative, the story each person's mind creates about what the challenge means. Understanding the story you're telling yourself gives you power to rewrite it. Let me give you an example. Imagine you send a text to a friend and don't hear back for several hours. What story does your mind tell? The anxious story might sound like this. They're ignoring me. I must have said something wrong. They're probably angry at me. Maybe they don't want to be friends anymore. I always ruin my relationships. What's wrong with me? Notice how fast that escalated? One unreturned text became evidence of a character flaw in a doomed friendship. The anxious mind moved from simple observation, no reply yet, to catastrophic conclusion. I always ruin everything, in seconds. Now, imagine a different story. They're probably busy. They might not have seen the message yet. They could be in a meeting, or driving, or their phone could be on silent. I'll hear from them when they get a chance. If I'm concerned, I can check in later. Same situation, completely different emotional outcome. The first story creates anxiety, hurt, and self-doubt. The second story creates patience and peace. Neither story might be true. You don't actually know why they haven't responded yet. But one story hurts you and the other doesn't. One story keeps you anxious for hours. The other lets you go on with your day. This is why working with your thoughts matters so much. The stories your mind tells determine much of how you feel. Cognitive behavioral therapy, usually called CBT, rests on one elegant principle. Change how you think, and you change how you feel, which then changes how you act. Imagine a triangle. One corner represents your thoughts. Another corner represents your emotions. The third corner represents your behaviors. These three corners constantly influence each other in a continuous loop. Here's how it works in practice. Your thought, "they're ignoring me," creates an emotion, anxiety, hurt, fear. That emotion drives a behavior. Maybe you send multiple follow-up texts, checking if something is wrong. Or maybe you withdraw and stop reaching out to people at all. That behavior then creates new thoughts. See, I'm being too clingy and needy. Or, nobody wants to talk to me. Which create more emotions, which drive more behaviors. Round and round it goes, often spiraling downward. CBT intervenes in this cycle, and it usually starts with thoughts because thoughts are the easiest part of the cycle to observe and challenge. You can't always control what emotion wells up inside you. Feelings often arise automatically before you have any say in the matter. You can't always control your first impulse about how to act, but with practice, you can learn to observe your thoughts and question them before they carry you away. Cognitive restructuring is a fancy term for a simple process. Examining your anxious thoughts to see if they hold up to scrutiny. It's like being a detective investigating your own mind. Let's use a real example. Suppose you receive a terse message from your boss. "Call me as soon as you can." Immediately, anxiety fills in the blanks with worst-case scenarios. "I'm getting fired. I must have made a terrible mistake. They're furious with me. My career is over." Cognitive restructuring pauses this spiral and asks, what evidence actually supports this fear? What evidence contradicts it? Evidence that might support the fear? The message was brief. They want to talk soon. Evidence that contradicts the fear. Your boss often sends brief messages because they're busy. They haven't mentioned any problems with your work. Last week, they praised a project you completed. Your performance reviews have been good. There are many possible reasons for a phone call that have nothing to do with problems. Usually, when you actually examine the evidence honestly, logic begins to undo panic. Maybe your boss wants to ask you to take on an exciting new project. Maybe they have a quick question about something. Maybe they just prefer phone calls to long email chains. Maybe they have good news to share. The point isn't to convince yourself that everything is fine. The point is to stop treating your worst fear as the only possibility. Let me repeat that. The point is to stop treating your worst fear as the only possibility. When you challenge anxious thoughts, you open up space for other explanations. Explanations that might be more accurate and definitely less painful. Over time, each effort you make to question your automatic response rewires how your brain labels uncertainty. Instead of automatically interpreting ambiguity as threat, your brain learns to interpret it as curiosity. "I wonder what they want to talk about" replaces "something terrible is happening." Avoidance feeds anxiety. Confrontation dissolves it. That's the core insight behind exposure therapy. When you're afraid of something, your natural instinct is to avoid it. Afraid of crowded places? Stay home. Afraid of public speaking? Turn down every opportunity to present. Afraid of social judgment? Keep to yourself. In the short term, avoidance feels like relief. You dodged the scary situation, and the anxiety fades. Your nervous system calms down because you're no longer near the thing that frightened you. This relief feels good, and it makes avoidance seem like the right choice. But in the long term, avoidance makes anxiety stronger. Every time you avoid something, you teach your brain that the thing really was dangerous. You confirm the fear. Your world gets smaller as you eliminate more and more situations that trigger anxiety, and the things you avoid become more frightening, not less, because you never get the chance to learn that they're actually survivable. Exposure therapy flips this process. It teaches gradual bravery, not reckless leaps into terrifying situations, but manageable steps that slowly expand your comfort zone. If crowds frighten you, you don't start by going to a packed concert. Maybe you start by standing in a quiet cafe for 10 minutes, just standing there, breathing, noticing that nothing bad happens. Next week, maybe you stay 15 minutes. The week after, maybe you go during a slightly busier time. Eventually, maybe you speak to the barista. Each small step shows your nervous system that the feared situation is survivable. Each time fear rises and then naturally falls, and it will fall because fear cannot sustain itself indefinitely in the absence of actual danger. Your neurons record a new truth. The world is safer than I imagined. This thing I feared didn't hurt me. This process is called habituation, and it's one of the most powerful mechanisms for reducing anxiety. When you expose yourself to something repeatedly and nothing bad happens, your brain gradually stops treating it as a threat. The first time you do something scary, your anxiety might be at a 10. The 10th time, it might be at a 5. The 50th time, it might barely register at all. The key is making the steps small enough that you can actually do them without triggering more anxiety. Too big a leap, and you might become overwhelmed and actually reinforce the fear. The right size step stretches you just beyond your comfort zone, but not so far that you break. Think of it like physical exercise. You want to challenge yourself enough to build strength, but not so much that you injure yourself. It also helps to know that anxiety, however uncomfortable, typically is not dangerous. When you're in a feared situation and your heart is racing and your palms are sweating, it feels terrible, but it's not typically harmful to you. Your body is doing exactly what it's designed to do in response to a perceived threat. Understanding this can help you stay in the feared situation long enough for the anxiety to naturally subside. It's also important to point out that while anxiety drains your energy, action restores it. This might sound backwards. When you feel exhausted and overwhelmed, doing things might be the last thing you want, but inactivity creates a downward spiral. You feel anxious, so you cancel plans. You stay in bed longer. You skip activities you used to enjoy. And the less you do, the worse you feel. The worse you feel, the less you do. Your world shrinks. Your mood drops. The anxiety gets worse. Behavioral activation breaks this cycle by scheduling small, achievable tasks that align with your values. These don't have to be major accomplishments or impressive achievements. Fold the laundry, text a friend, step outside for 5 minutes, water your plants, cook a simple meal, take a shower. These actions sound ordinary, almost trivial, but to an anxious mind, they're proof of agency. They're reminders that you can still do things, that you have some control over your life. That behavior can lead emotion instead of always following it. Start with a list of activities that normally bring you joy or satisfaction, even if they don't feel appealing right now. Rate each activity by how difficult it feels, from 1 to 10, and how much it aligns with what matters to you. Then, pick the lowest difficulty items that still feel meaningful. Schedule them. Put them on your calendar like appointments you can't miss. And then do them, even if you don't feel like it, especially if you don't feel like it. Often, motivation follows action rather than preceding it. You don't wait until you feel motivated to act. You act, and motivation follows. Movement creates emotion. The doing comes first. The feeling of wanting to do it comes later. It's likely you've heard of mindfulness. Perhaps you think of it as sitting still and clearing your mind of all thoughts. In cognitive work with anxiety, it's something different and more practical. It's being aware of your feelings and thoughts without judgment. Instead of saying, "I am anxious," try saying, "I'm noticing anxiety." That one word, noticing, introduces distance, a breathing space where choice returns. When you say, "I am anxious," you identify completely with the anxiety. You become it. The anxiety is you, and you are the anxiety. But when you say, "I'm noticing anxiety," you've created separation. You're the observer, and anxiety is the thing being observed. It's happening, yes, but it's not the totality of who you are. This shift might seem small, almost trivially small, but it's profound. It's the difference between being caught in a hurricane and watching a storm from a safe distance. You can see the storm, acknowledge it, understand it, but you're not being tossed around by it. Mindfulness also helps you catch anxious thoughts when they first appear, before they've gained momentum. It's easier to redirect a worry when it's just starting, a small spark, than when it's been looping through your mind for an hour, a roaring fire. Practice noticing your thoughts like clouds passing through the sky. You don't grab onto them or push them away. You just observe. There's a worried thought. There's a self-critical thought. There's a fear about the future. Name them and let them pass. You don't have to engage with every thought that appears in your mind. You can just notice it and let it drift by. Many people find it helpful to label thoughts by category. When a worried thought appears, you might silently note, worrying. When you notice planning or problem-solving happening, you might note, planning. When you notice judging yourself or others, note, judging. This labeling creates distance. It reminds you that you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness that notices thoughts. Mindfulness doesn't require sitting in meditation for an hour, though that can certainly help if it appeals to you. Mindfulness can be practiced in moments throughout your day. While washing dishes, notice the sensation of water on your hands. While walking, feel your feet touching the ground. While talking to someone, really listen rather than planning what you'll say next. These small moments of presence add up over time. Regular mindfulness practice has been shown to actually change the brain's structure and function. Areas associated with emotional regulation grow stronger. The amygdala, the brain's alarm center, becomes less reactive. The prefrontal cortex, the brain's rational executive center, gains more influence. These changes don't happen overnight, but with consistent practice, mindfulness literally rewires your brain for calm. Mindfulness can turn worry from a hurricane into a breeze, still there, but manageable. Cognitive techniques don't erase worry. They won't make you immune to anxiety. What they do is retrain perception. They help you see more clearly. Each time you question a fear-filled thought, you chip away at anxiety's false authority. Clarity replaces distortion. Choice replaces automatic, unthoughtful reaction. This takes practice. Lots of practice. At first, it might feel awkward or forced. You might catch yourself deep into an anxious spiral before you remember to question the thoughts driving it. That's normal. That's part of learning. Be patient with yourself. You're literally rewiring neural pathways that have been running the same way for years, possibly for decades. That doesn't happen overnight. But it does happen, gradually and reliably, with consistent practice. Think of it like learning a musical instrument or a new language. At first, everything feels conscious and deliberate. You have to think about every note, every word. But eventually, with enough repetition, it becomes more automatic. You start questioning anxious thoughts without having to remind yourself to do it. Your thoughts are powerful, but they're not permanent. They're not facts. They're perceptions and interpretations that can be questioned, examined, and revised. Now let's look at some of the specific thinking patterns that fuel anxiety, the hidden habits called cognitive distortions that quietly exaggerate fear. Recognizing these distortions is the key to mastering them. Our minds love shortcuts. In computer science, they call these shortcuts heuristics. In psychology, we call them cognitive biases. Whatever name you use, they serve the same purpose, helping your brain make quick decisions without having to analyze everything in detail. Most of the time, these shortcuts work well. They help you navigate a complex world efficiently. You don't have to think carefully about every single decision. Your brain uses patterns and shortcuts to move quickly. But when anxiety runs high, your brain's shortcut system goes haywire. It aims for certainty, even if it has to invent it. These mental errors create false alarms. They're like funhouse mirrors that distort reality in specific, predictable ways. The good news is that once you learn to recognize these distortions, you can correct them. Awareness begins the repair. Let's look at 6 of the most common cognitive distortions. You'll probably recognize several from your own thinking. First up, all or nothing thinking, or, as it is also known, black and white thinking. You see things in extremes with no middle ground. Either you're perfect or you're a complete failure. Either people love you or they hate you. Either the situation is wonderful or it's terrible. There's no room for nuance, for partial success, for mixed outcomes, for gray. Everything gets sorted into one extreme category or the other. For example, you might think, if I'm not the best at this, I've failed completely. The problem with this thinking is that almost nothing in life is purely one extreme or the other. Most situations, most people, most outcomes exist in shades of gray. When you think in black and white, you miss the entire spectrum between the extremes. You miss the progress you've made, The partial victories, the areas where you're doing okay, even if you're not perfect. To challenge all or nothing thinking, look for the middle ground. Instead of, I completely failed, consider, I struggled with some parts, but succeeded at others. Instead of, this is a disaster, consider, this is difficult but manageable. Life rarely happens in extremes, so thinking should rarely be extreme either. In a similar vein, overgeneralization is when you take one negative event and treat it as a never-ending pattern. One becomes always. A single disappointment becomes proof that nothing ever works out for you. One mistake means you always make mistakes. For example, you might think, I made one mistake in the meeting, so I always ruin important presentations. One mistake doesn't define you. One bad experience doesn't predict the future. But overgeneralization makes you believe it does. Words like always, never, every time, and nothing are red flags for overgeneralization. To challenge overgeneralization, look for exceptions. If you're thinking, I always mess up, ask yourself, have there been times when you didn't mess up? Almost certainly, yes. If you're thinking, nothing ever works out for me, consider specific instances when things did work out. One negative event is just one event, not a permanent pattern. Now, let's consider catastrophizing. Catastrophizing is when you imagine the worst possible outcome and treat it as the most likely outcome, even when it's actually very unlikely. You blow things out of proportion, turning a potential inconvenience into a disaster. For example, you might think, if I get nervous during my speech, I'll forget everything. Everyone will think I'm incompetent. I'll lose my job, and my career will be ruined forever. Notice how one feared moment escalates into complete life destruction? That is catastrophizing. Each step in the chain might be possible, but the chances of the entire catastrophic sequence happening are tiny. When you catastrophize, you see unlikely worst-case scenarios as inevitable. To challenge the thinking behind a predicted catastrophe, ask yourself, what's actually most likely to happen? What has happened in similar situations before? What would I tell a friend who was imagining this same catastrophe? Usually, the most likely outcome is far less dramatic than the catastrophic one. Our current social media and news sources often display catastrophic patterns of thinking. If you're prone to this type of distorted thinking yourself, can you identify it when you see it practiced by others? Personalization is when you assume that everything relates to you, especially negative things. When something goes wrong, you automatically think it's your fault, even when you had little or no control over the situation. For example, you might think, my friend seems upset today. It must be something I did wrong. Maybe your friend is upset because they didn't sleep well, or they're stressed about something completely unrelated to you, or they're worried about a family member, or they're not even upset at all, and you're misreading their expression. But personalization makes you the center of every negative event. It assumes that if something is wrong, you must be the cause. Next is, mind reading is when you assume you know what others are thinking, especially about you, and it's usually negative. You make these assumptions without any actual evidence. For example, you might think, they didn't text back. They must be angry at me. Or, everyone at the party thought I was boring. Unless someone explicitly tells you what they're thinking, you don't actually know. You're guessing. Mind reading is just guessing. But anxiety treats these guesses as established facts. Finally, so-called should statements involve having rigid rules about how you, other people, or the world should be. When reality doesn't match these rules, you feel anxious, frustrated, or guilty. For example, you might think, I should always stay calm, or they should have known better, or life should be fair. Should statements create unnecessary suffering because reality often doesn't match our shoulds. The word should implies obligation and judgment. It's different from saying, I would prefer, or it would be nice if. Should is demanding. Should is rigid. And rigid expectations that clash with flexible reality create constant friction and disappointment. Each of the mentioned distortions shrinks when challenged with gentle questions. You don't have to become a harsh critic of your own thoughts. Think of yourself as a curious scientist investigating data, not a lawyer questioning a hostile witness. When you catch an anxious thought, ask yourself, what's the actual evidence for this thought? Not feelings or assumptions, but concrete facts. If you're thinking, everyone thought my presentation was terrible, what specific evidence do you have? Did anyone actually say that? Or are you mind reading? Ask yourself, what's the probability? If you find yourself catastrophizing, ask yourself realistically, what are the actual odds of this worst-case scenario happening? Often, the things we fear most have a very low probability of occurring. Ask yourself, how would I see this situation if it happened to someone else? We're often much kinder and more rational when evaluating other people's situations than our own. If your best friend came to you with this same worry, what would you tell them? Would you say they always ruin everything? Or would you offer a more balanced perspective? Ask yourself, am I confusing a thought with a fact? Just because you think something doesn't make it true. Thoughts are mental events, not reality itself. They're suggestions your mind offers, not objective truth. Ask yourself, what would be a more balanced way of looking at this? You don't have to jump from extremely negative to extremely positive. Just find a middle ground that's more accurate. This gentle logic grounds the runaway imagination that anxiety loves to ride. Here's a practical tool you can use daily. Get a notebook or open a note on your phone. Create 3 columns. In the first column, write the anxious thought exactly as it appears in your mind. Don't censor it or make it sound more rational. Capture the raw thought with all its exaggeration and fear. In the second column, identify which cognitive distortion or distortions are present. Is it over-personalizing, all-or-nothing thinking, mind reading? There might be more than one. In the third column, write a more balanced, evidence-based alternative based on your questioning of the original thought. This isn't about forced positive thinking. It's about accuracy. For example, the first column might contain, I'll never be good at public speaking. I'm going to mess up this presentation, and everyone will think I'm incompetent. The second column would identify all or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, mind reading. The third column would offer, public speaking is a skill I'm still developing. I might feel nervous, and I might make minor mistakes, but that doesn't make me incompetent. Most people in the audience want me to succeed, and they'll likely be more understanding than I fear. Many successful speakers still feel nervous. Nervousness isn't the same as incompetence. Read your balanced rewrite out loud. Repetition carves new neural pathways, healthier ones. Do this exercise daily, even when you're not particularly anxious. It's like going to the gym. You build the muscle so it's there when you need it. The more you practice cognitive restructuring when you're calm, the more accessible it becomes when you're in the grip of anxiety. Over time, you'll notice that you start catching cognitive distortions more quickly. Instead of realizing hours later that you were fearing a catastrophic outcome, you'll notice it in the moment. Instead of believing anxious thoughts automatically, you'll develop a habit of questioning them. This is the goal. Not to eliminate anxious thoughts, but to change your relationship with them. Let me share some more examples of how to apply this 3-column technique to common anxious thoughts. If your first column contains, "I'm late to this meeting," "I'm so unreliable," the second column might identify overgeneralization and should statements. The third column could read, "I value punctuality, and today I got delayed by unexpected traffic. This one instance doesn't define my overall reliability. I'll send an apology and adjust my planning for next time." If your first column contains, "My friend hasn't responded to my text. They're obviously ignoring me and don't want to be friends anymore," the second column might identify mind reading, catastrophizing, and jumping to conclusions. The third column could read, "My friend is probably busy or didn't see the message yet. People have their own lives and schedules. I'll give them time to respond. If I'm still concerned after a reasonable period, I can follow up kindly." If your first column contains, "I need to be perfect at everything I do, or else I'm failing," the second column might identify all or nothing thinking and should statements. The third column could read, "Perfection isn't realistic or necessary. What matters is doing my best and learning from mistakes. Growth comes from imperfection, not from never failing." If your first column contains, "Something feels off today. Something bad is definitely going to happen," the second column might identify emotional reasoning, another common cognitive distortion, thinking that because you feel anxious, danger must be present. The third column could read, "I'm feeling anxious, which is uncomfortable, but feelings aren't facts. My anxiety doesn't predict the future. I can feel nervous and still be safe." Each reframe rescues truth from distortion. It brings you back to reality instead of the scary fiction anxiety creates. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, wrote something profound. He said that between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Think about what he's saying. Something happens, a stimulus. Before you react, your response, there's a gap, a moment, a breath. In that gap lives freedom. Most of the time, we don't notice this gap. Stimulus and response feel instantaneous. Something triggers us, and we immediately react with emotion or behavior. It feels like there's no choice involved, but the gap is always there, and it can be widened through practice. When you notice an anxious thought arising, pause, just for a second. In that pause, you have choice. You can automatically believe the thought, or you can question it. You can react impulsively, or you can respond thoughtfully. That pause is small, but powerful. Each time you use it, you teach your nervous system that there's space between trigger and reaction. That space is where peace lives. Cognitive mastery doesn't erase fear. It corrects the lens you see through. It invites a more refined perspective. When the view is clear or undistorted, reality can look a lot less threatening. When reality looks less threatening, you can respond with wisdom instead of panic. That brings us to the end of part 2. You've learned that your mind is a storyteller and that anxious minds tell frightening stories. You've been introduced to, or perhaps reintroduced to, cognitive behavioral therapy and how thoughts, emotions, and behaviors influence each other in a continuous cycle. You've been told about cognitive restructuring, examining thoughts like a detective, looking for evidence, questioning assumptions, finding more balanced interpretations. You've heard how exposure therapy and gradually facing fears, rather than avoiding them, ultimately weakens anxiety's hold. You've been told or reminded about behavioral activation and how action can lead emotion, even when motivation is absent. You've heard how mindfulness can create distance from your thoughts and transform them from overwhelming hurricanes into manageable breezes. And you've been told about the common cognitive distortions that fuel anxiety: all or nothing thinking, overgeneralization, catastrophizing, personalization, mind reading, and should statements. You now have tools to recognize these distortions and challenge them with gentle, curious questioning. The mind, like the body, can be trained. With consistent practice, anxious thought patterns can be replaced with more balanced, accurate ones. You don't have to believe every worried thought that appears in your consciousness. You can observe, question, and choose. In Part 3, we'll go deeper still. We'll explore the philosophical roots of anxiety and discover how questions of meaning, authenticity, and acceptance can transform your relationship with worry.